Really delighted that Christof Rühl, BP's chief economist, could be here today. This is sort of a season of some outlooks. The medium-term oil market report just came out. Earlier this week, we had Statoil's chief economist presenting their outlook. And Christof's going to talk a little bit about where we are today with energy, with the Statistical review. And obviously, they also put out the global energy outlook. But the focus today is on BP's Statistical review of world energy, which was just released. And as you all know, people who follow the energy world closely, those two analyses that come out of BP are two of the most closely watched and used resources for people who study and analyze global energy markets. This is sort of the farewell tour that Christof is doing, having announced recently he's leaving BP to join the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. But we're really delighted that he could be here to present again, as he did last year, the statistical review from BP. I won't go through his entire record, but for people who are energy wonks, Christof is a rock star in the energy world, widely speaks and travels widely, a very distinguished track record in both academia and economic policy making, as well as his long tenure at BP. Before that, he was at the World Bank, where he served as the bank's chief economist in Russia and Brazil. Before that, he worked in the office of the chief economist at the EBRD in London and had an academic background before that. So I always learn a huge amount listening to Christof, and look forward to doing that today with all of you. So please join me in welcoming Christof Rühl.
Thank you very much. First of all of you for coming, and then Jason for your very kind words, overly kind. You all know the Statistical Review, I assume, our book of data. The purpose of this review is and always has been to provide objective data on global energy developments and then to chronicle changes in global energy markets year by year in as rigorous a fashion as we can possibly muster. So what you're about to see is another chapter. We're dealing with 2013, and I will go through what happened in 2013, first with a reference to the bigger picture, the link between energy and the economy, this mutual link, I should add. Then I have to drag you through the fuel-by-fuel section, the hard part, which is stories and numbers. I hope there are some interesting stories, not just numbers in there. And then I'd like to come back to the big picture, the linkages between energy and GDP. But before we start all this, to begin with, let me step back a little. 10 years ago, obviously the energy world looked rather different from what we see today. And much of what we take for granted today has changed over these 10 years. So I think it's always a good first step if you look back at where you come from before trying assessing today. What have been some of these major changes? 10 years ago, the developing world, which we simply classify as the group of non-OECD economies, had started to embark on a period of rapid economic growth. The term BRICS, for example, was coined in 2001. And from 2001 onwards, this showed up as an energy gap. Global energy demand growth became dominated by the non-OECD. In 2008, the non-OECD then overtook the OECD in energy consumption. China, rightly or wrongly, came to symbolize this ascent, overtaking the European Union in 2007, the US in 2010, and last year, overtaking in energy consumption all of North America. Many of us would have found that hard to believe 10 years ago. Energy markets are huge, and the supply response then can be sluggish. So prices started to rise and to diverge. Oil prices, of course, rose the fastest, we all know that, but many of the other implications are easily forgotten. It's not only that we think today of oil prices north of $100 per barrel as normal, it is also that maybe even here in the room there are many an analyst gainfully employed by investigating gas price spreads, an activity which 10 years ago would not have attracted much attention. One trend that has not changed is reserves growth. It was always one of our most popular statistics, but saying that proved reserves had increased yet again after yet another year of rapid oil, gas, or coal consumption growth created a lot more disbelief 10 years ago than it does today. But increase they did, Proved oil and gas reserves are up 27% and 19% respectively over these last 10 years, despite production growth of 11% and 29%. The perceptions change, not only about reserves. A supply response has always existed, but it became widely recognized only after it triggered the emergence of new sources of supply. And the biggest item on this list has to be the emergence of unconventional oil and gas resources. That this would happen, of all the places in the world, in the competitive energy markets of North America makes perfect economic sense in retrospect. But who would have thought at the time? If we loosely group together fuels that may classify as new simply by virtue of not having been around 10 years ago, including renewables, motivated by also newly found concerns of climate change as much as by high fossil fuel prices, then these new sources of supply last year accounted for fully 81% of global energy production growth. It's time to look perhaps at this in more detail. Now, global economic growth has been softening since 2010, the year of the big economic stimuli. Last year it was 3%, a little weaker than 2012, and considerably below its 10-year average, which now includes the years of boom and bust before and after the economic crisis. Economic performance softened in the non-OECD and the OECD alike, but the economic growth gap between them narrowed only very slightly. Energy consumption followed economic growth, but with a twist. Energy consumption growth in the OECD has been flat for the last 10 years, despite economic growth of 18%. And if we take a particularly appealing subgroup, namely the 28 member states of today's European Union, then last year's energy consumption there was back at the level of 1988, despite cumulative economic growth of 54%, which raises an intriguing question, namely whether it's possible to have sustained economic growth with constant or falling energy consumption. Meanwhile, in the non-OECD, stronger economic growth and industrialization necessitated continued consumption growth before, during, and after the crisis. The relationship between economic growth and energy growth was quite similar in the OECD and non-OECD for the 10 years before the crisis. After the crisis, and likely associated with these massive fiscal stimuli which many non-OECD economies gave themselves, energy intensity improved faster in the OECD. 2013 has broken this pattern. Global primary energy consumption accelerated from 1.8 to 2.3%, which is just a tick below the 10-year average, and despite slackening economic growth. But for the two subgroups, fortunes diverged quite radically. OECD demand rose by 1.2%, offsetting an equal decline the previous year, despite slowing and lackluster economic performance, and almost on a par with GDP growth. Non-OECD consumption, in contrast, grew by only 3.1%, the slowest rate for 13 years, except for the crisis year 2009, and substantially below GDP growth. North America, the only region globally to show above average growth, has driven the OECD acceleration, with energy demand growth even faster than GDP. The non-OECD slowdown, in turn, was concentrated in Asia, with energy consumption growth below 4% for only the second time in 12 years, while economic growth held steady. And if you go one level below, it turns out that the contrasting experience of North America and Asia reflect the differing fortunes of the world's largest energy consumers, China and the US. Together, they have accounted for 70% of the increase in world consumption growth. In 2013, Chinese energy growth slipped from 7% to 4.7%, well below its long-term trend, which is more than 8.5%. Although the People's Republic reported unchanged economic growth of 7.7%. The Chinese slowdown was concentrated in coal, but we will see it's visible in oil as well. Meanwhile, US primary energy consumption grew by 2.9%, rebounding from a similar decrease in 2012. Some of this was due to weather effects, but beyond the weather, there are signs of underlying strength in US industrial sector energy use, in particular of oil products. These effects and the impact of these two countries are visible even if we only look at global fuel aggregates. China is responsible for the relative weakness of coal growth, and the US for the relative strength of oil growth. We'll come back to these details in a minute. All told, the diverging performance of China and the US has caused the energy gap between non-OECD and OECD energy consumption growth to narrow very sharply. It became the smallest since the year 2000. Now the question is, what can such energy, before we go into the details, what can such energy data tell us? Are these data points a harbinger of things to come, or just a one-off aberration? The appropriate answer, of course, is it's too early to tell. In our textbooks, energy demand is the consequence of economic growth. In reality, where data measurement is less than perfect, energy data often allows for conclusions about real economic activity. And in the present context, I find it easy to see how abundant domestic resources in the US would eventually give a boost to the economy, not just to energy demand. But I find it much harder to understand how the fundamental restructuring in the Chinese economy underway today would leave an imprint only on energy consumption growth and not without eventually also affecting economic growth. Let's go through this fuel by fuel and come back to this big divergence a little bit later. Starting with the market for oil. Oil markets over the last 3 years have been high, but they also have been remarkably stable. In 2013, they dipped slightly, with dated Brent averaging almost $109 per barrel, which is $3 below the average of both 2011 and 2012. This has been the third consecutive year of prices above 100, a first in both real and nominal terms. But it has also been the 3-year period on record with the lowest price volatility since 1970, since the end of posted prices. The stability in oil prices betrays significant changes in the underlying balance between consumption and production. In 2013, global consumption growth exceeded production growth by a wide margin, the exact opposite of the dynamics in 2012. As a result, inventories fell. And 2013 was yet another year of turbulence in oil production. We are all familiar by now with the ongoing story of rapid growth in the US. But 2013 was also yet another year of significant supply disruptions, most notably in North Africa and the Middle East. So why did prices then remain so stable? We will go through the numbers first and then come back to this question. Starting with consumption, which last year rose by about 1.4 million barrels per day, or 1.4%, higher than both 2012 and the 10-year average. As has become the norm, growth was driven by the emerging economies of the non-OECD, which for the first time accounted for the majority of global consumption. OECD demand remained rather stagnant. In the OECD, the US stood out as its consumption grew by 400,000 barrels per day, the fastest growth of any country last year, and in volume terms outpacing China for the very first time since 1999. In contrast, consumption for the rest of the OECD fell by a larger than average 380,000 barrels per day, led by a decline in Japan, where oil was backed out of power generation by renewables, coal, and improved efficiency. European consumption also fell by 130,000 barrels per day, with the largest decline seen in the countries most affected by the economic crisis and recession, such as Italy, Spain, and Greece. Non-OECD consumption rose by 1.4 million barrels per day, or 3.1%, well below the 10-year average. This weakness was again especially pronounced in China, where demand grew by only 390,000 barrels per day, the lowest since the recession in 2009. Growth in India hit its lowest level since 2001 as subsidies were reduced, while in the Middle East, growth was limited by civil unrest and also by a rising use of natural gas in Saudi Arabia's power production. A review of oil consumption by product can help to identify underlying economic forces. Light distillates, such as gasoline, are more commonly associated with being dependent on prices, and they have been the fastest growing product category for the second consecutive year. Middle distillates, such as diesel, are commonly much more associated with the strength of economic performance. They grew only slowly. The slowdown in middle distillate demand growth was again entirely driven by the developing world, where growth almost halved. And within this group, it was once again China which accounted for by far the largest part of that slowdown. Distinguishing by product category also helps to disentangle the question why the US saw such a dramatic increase in oil consumption last year, up 400,000 barrels per day, remember, against an average annual decline of 110,000 barrels over the last 10 years. It cannot be explained by economic growth, which slowed from 2.8 to 1.9% last year. The rise was focused in the industrial sector, including refining and petrochemicals, which contributed almost 80% of net growth. Much of this growth was for light products, in particular LPG, facilitated by the very robust growth of domestic natural gas liquids, which in turn have a price discount and prices being driven down significantly over the last few years. Just as a footnote, we have not seen something extraordinary happening in industrial sector demand for natural gas, which is what people talk about when they talk about industrial renaissance. We have seen it in oil. Turning to production, 2013 once again can be characterized as a tale of two major developments. Supply disruptions, especially in the North Africa and the Middle East, of historic proportions, and an equally historic US growth. I come back to both of those when we reviewed the data. Global output rose slightly last year due to the largest increase in non-OPEC countries since 2002. The main contributors to this growth was, of course, the US, but supplies have also grown in Canada and in Russia. Russia, with plus 150,000 barrels per day, posted a record high for the post-Soviet era, and Canadian production, up to 110,000, reached an all-time high due to continued oil sands growth. These increases more than offset declines in mature areas such as the North Sea. Meanwhile, OPEC production contracted by about 600,000 barrels per day. In addition to these unplanned disruptions, to which I will come in a second, it was also Saudi Arabia which cut output by about 110,000 barrels per day after producing at record levels in 2012. The declines were only partly offset by an increase in the UAE, which set a new record for itself. Average OPEC crude production was near the group's 30 million barrels per day production target, which has been in place since December 2011. US oil production exceeded 10 million barrels per day in 2013, reaching the highest level since 1986. Driven by tight oil plays, US production rose by over 1.1 million barrels per day, the second consecutive year of above 1 million barrels per day production growth, and the second consecutive year of a new record of the biggest increase in US history of oil production. And if you look closely, it was indeed only Saudi Arabia which ever had a bigger increase than the US in 2013. And to be very precise, production in Saudi Arabia increased by more on an annual basis 9 times, but 6 out of these 9 times it was based on existing spare production capacity. So the Saudis had cut and then they could tap the spare production capacity. So in terms of organic growth with capacity expansion, what we have seen last year in the US was the 4th biggest increase in annual oil production ever, all countries at all times. So far this year, it continues, and so far production is up by 1.3 million barrels per day. As in recent years, supply disruptions were large and, as I mentioned, concentrated in North Africa and the Middle East. Libya has been a focal point. Following initial outages of 1.2 million barrels per day in 2011 due to the civil war, production staged a near full recovery in 2012, but then, with renewed unrest in the second half of 2013, it fell again by more than 500,000 barrels per day last year. Iranian production also declined as a result of continued international sanctions. And then we have significant losses also in Syria, the two Sudans, and Yemen. Cumulative supply disruptions since the advent of what is now known as the Arab Spring in early 2011 from these countries have reached an extraordinary 3 million barrels per day. This is the highest easily since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iraqi-Kuwait war. We are now in a better position to return to the question of why oil prices were so stable the last 3 years, despite these violent shifts we observed in production. For the biggest part, the answer has to be that the supply disruptions in Africa and the Middle East were matched almost exactly, barrel by barrel, one-to-one, by the shale-related production increases in the US. It's a very fair conclusion to say that oil markets would look rather different today had we witnessed only these supply disruptions as they historically actually occurred. And vice versa, it's an equally fair statement to say that oil markets would also look very different today had we only witnessed the shale revolution, so-called, in the US. Now, very importantly, I think, this match is nothing but pure coincidence. Of course, higher prices eventually will trigger more shale production, but otherwise there is virtually nothing of logic or of substance which connects these two developments. And as a result, I think that markets will remain on edge, or perhaps a better phrase, when you think of prices, will remain eerily calm until one of these sides will gain the upper hand. In an interesting way, this current standoff finds itself reflected in the relationship between prices and inventories. Commercial inventories contracted in 2013, ending the year down by almost 100 million barrels. This is the lowest year-end level since 2004. At the start of the year, inventories were ample, following strong production growth in 2012, but then stronger demand growth corrected this, and when Libyan supply collapsed in September, OECD inventories started to fall rapidly. Stocks have remained low so far this year. But there's a more subtle dimension to this inventory data. The relationship between the level of OECD commercial inventories and prices has shifted since the advent of significant supply disruptions in early 2011. The shape of the forward curve since then indicates that market participants are willing to pay a higher premium relative to future prices to hold physical inventories than was the case in the pre-disruption era before 2011. This is a clear indication, and actually a picture like this is as clear indication as you ever get, of an increased desire for precautionary inventory holdings. Even as inventories fell in late 2013 and so far this year, this higher premium has remained in place. Now, another way of looking at this is to say that at current inventory levels, under the old pre-disruption regime, they would have corresponded to lower spot prices and or higher future prices. If you want to make it real simple, fix the long-term price in your head, and then you have the difference just in spot prices between before and after 2011. Let me quickly turn to refining. Global refining also has been struggling for years, squeezed between excess capacity and slower throughput growth. Regional disparities are adding to the woes of the sector, with more capacity being added east of Suez and with US throughputs rising as a result of rising tight oil production. Since crude exports from the US are legally constrained, US refineries are processing the discounted domestic crude at home and export products instead. 2014 has seen a continuation of this trend. Global refining capacity grew by 1.4 million barrels per day last year, the highest net capacity addition since 2009. Capacity growth was led by China, but the Middle East wasn't far behind. Global crude runs, in contrast, grew by only 0.4 million barrels per day, and as a result, global spare capacity is now almost 7 million barrels per day more than it was in 2005, the low point in our time series. Despite this dismal background, global refining margins were strong during the first half of 2013 due to a combination of cold northern hemisphere weather and refinery outages. Last year's capacity and throughput developments meant that global average refinery utilization has to slip to the lowest rate since 1987. Utilization in the non-OECD fell because of the fast pace of capacity additions. But OECD refinery utilization increased a little bit, with US crude runs benefiting from continued price discount and with refinery shutdowns in the rest of the OECD. The US added new crude oil pipeline capacity that helped to alleviate the transportation bottlenecks which drive relative WTI prices. But with tight oil output growing at a very rapid clip, logistics additions are inevitably less uniform, And so the ramp up in crude supplies. And as a result, the differential between Brent and WTI continues to be very volatile. The new pipeline infrastructure has made it possible to move more crude to the Gulf Coast. But export constraints mean that the price discounts have now spread to a wider range of crudes. As a consequence, US refiners exported record volumes of distillate last year rather than replenish domestic stocks. Conversely, European crude runs in 2013 fell to their lowest annual level since 1985. European demand is contracting and, different from Asia, today's problems can only be fixed by reducing capacity. Natural gas markets are slowly transforming themselves, as we know, on the back of two major developments: the shale gas revolution in the US and its knock-on effects, and the increasing integration of hitherto segmented regional markets supported by the rapid expansion of liquefied natural gas. In 2013, both of these forces took a breather. US shale gas production growth slowed, and LNG expansion remained very modest. Globally, growth of consumption, production, and trade all slowed. Regional price differentials narrowed. As in all other fuels, the demand slowdown was more pronounced in the developing world. And in fact, natural gas turned out to be the only fuel where OECD consumption growth has outpaced non-OECD growth. Like oil, tracing OECD growth leads one into the US. But unlike oil, China was not the reason for the weak growth in the non-OECD. To disentangle what happened, let's start with the latest chapter of the evolving US shale story. This chapter starts with slowing production growth from more than 7% in 2011 to 5% in 2012 and 1.3% in 2013. This has nothing to do with running out of shale, as some pundits have claimed, but everything to do with the fungibility of drilling rigs and the power of price signals. US gas prices have hit a 13-year low, if you remember, in 2012, and started rebounding in the wake of a cold winter early in 2013. For the year, they were up 35% on average, almost offsetting the 2012 decline. However, because of the persistently high differential between oil and gas prices, this was not enough, this price increase, to accelerate production growth. It remained more attractive to chase liquids, i.e. to continue to divert drilling rigs from shale gas to tight oil production. Almost all the growth in gas production last year came from associated and wet gas. Dry gas and dry shale gas also was down. Higher prices, low storage, and the demand for heating, which is signaled by an increase in residential and commercial demand, have, however, or were sufficient to induce a dramatic pull out of natural gas from power generation, which is, of course, the one point where natural gas faces heads-on competition with other fuels. Total US consumption grew by 2.4%, but gas-fired power generation declined by almost 9%, substituted by coal, which in turn experienced growth of 5%. For the first time since 2008, gas in this way lost market share in US power generation. It fell back almost 3 percentage points, and this was the biggest such loss of market share in power since 1973. LNG projects, switching from shale to LNG, are large and investments can be very lumpy. Currently, supply growth is in the middle of a multi-year lull with very limited capacity expansion. In 2013, supplies expanded by merely 0.6%. This is, of course, keeping markets tight, allocating flexible cargoes to those willing and able to pay high prices. Small wonder, then, that we are witnessing massive adjustments. Asia, where fully 81% of natural gas imports are met by LNG, remained the prime destination, with about 3/4 of all cargoes headed for that region. And within Asia, Japan remained the world's largest LNG importer, with post-Fukushima demand for LNG persisting at record levels. But gas-fired power generation power plants in Japan are now fully utilized, and so Japanese imports have stopped growing. Instead, South Korea assumed the mantle of recording the world's largest import growth And once again, it was triggered by nuclear outages. Meanwhile, in China, big strides were made toward the stated political goal of increasing the share of natural gas in the national energy mix, which currently is only a little above 5%. China logged the biggest increase in gas consumption in the world last year, and although production also recorded the second largest global increment, this still left a large gap for import growth. This gap was filled by imports of rising LNG as well as from pipeline imports. Most of the pipeline imports came from Central Asia, and within Central Asia, it was Turkmenistan which accounted for the lion's share. And in Turkmenistan, coincidence or not, tentative steps towards domestic price reform have lowered domestic gas consumption by just the same amount by which pipeline exports increased. You can sense there was some pressure in that system there. The flip side of higher demand growth and limited LNG availability in Asian markets can be, of course, that it puts the spotlight on problems with domestic production. India is the prime example. Caps on producer prices have stalled investment and last year have led to the world's largest decline in gas production. Lack of cheaper priced domestic gas and the huge price advantage of coal over LNG imports have caused large-scale substitution of gas with coal, and that assigned to India also the world's largest decline in gas consumption. Ironically, almost a third of the coal which replaced gas imports was itself coming from abroad. Europe took a rain check on the competition for LNG, and it was helped in doing so by Russia. European Union production appears in terminal decline, and consumption reached the lowest level since 1999. Last year, consumption by 1.1% and production by 0.5% both declined slightly. Imports also fell a little. As in the US, the year had started with a cold winter and low storage levels. Demand for heating drove up spot prices by more than 12% for the year, whereas oil index contract prices fell gently and in line with the price of oil. Gas lost the competition in power generation against cheaper coal and non-fossil fuels. In power, its market share declined by more than that of coal, while the market share of non-fossil fuels gained. Overall, though, EU gas consumption still fell less than coal because of the increased heating demand. Again, gas lost the competition where it faces competition and was partially saved by increased demand for heating where it doesn't face competition. As was the case for global oil markets, European Union imports in gas were affected by the social unrest plaguing Africa and North Africa. Falling imports from North Africa, Nigeria, but also from Norway, meant a need for alternative deliveries. In the event, Russia stepped into the void, eliminating a need for Europe to compete for expensive LNG. The net result was a big shift in the composition of imports, with imports from Russia into the EU rising by almost 20%. This then is a market reversal of the loss in market share which Gazprom had suffered in 2012. In 2012, Russia lost 12% of the US gas market to Norway because Gazprom maintained oil price indexation while Norway adjusted its prices closer to spot prices. In 2013, the rapid increase of European spot prices eroded much of the previous differential, but we know from Gazprom's own financial accounts that Gazprom also offered discounts and rebates to sell gas on more competitive terms. Russia in this way bucked the global trend. Gas production increased by 2.4% or 12.4 BCM, the largest production increase anywhere in the world, and it happened on the back of higher capacity utilization and also of increasing output from independent gas producers. Now in Russia, an independent gas producer is any gas producer except Gazprom, which holds the export monopoly. And last year, these independents accounted for 28% of domestic gas production in Russia, but they also accounted for, at the same time for 39% of consumption in Russia because they offer gas more cheaply. And this erosion of its market share at home allowed Gazprom to direct more resources abroad. You can read it two ways. They were forced to export or they were happy to export. Leave that for the discussion. A drop in domestic gas consumption has also helped, in part because when you remember Russia's Far East suffered severe flooding at the beginning of 2013, And the one silver lining in this cloud of a disaster was the second biggest growth in Russian hydropower on record. Together with falling electricity demand, this reduced the call on all fuels for power generation, including for natural gas, and in this way also made more room for exports. All told, Russian exports grew almost 19%, or 10.7 BCM last year. Now, how do these differing regional stories affect the evolution of global gas trade? Trade has grown at more than twice the rate of global consumption for at least 2 decades, with LNG expanding even faster and gaining share against pipelines. Since 2011, this relationship has started to decouple, with trade growth slower than consumption and with LNG losing market share. In 2013, gas trade expanded by only 1.8%, slightly above consumption growth, but considerably below the long-term average, with pipeline trade again expanding faster than LNG. But this temporary lull in LNG supply growth should not obscure the general direction of travel, which goes towards a more integrated and interconnected international gas world. One episode from 2013 nicely illustrates the degree of integration international gas markets have already achieved. I told you how gas was displaced by strong hydro growth in Russia and then exported to Europe. At the same time, LNG, destined for Europe, was re-exported for this reason to drought-stricken South American markets. In effect, what happened was that hydroelectricity from Russia, where there was too much rainfall, was shipped halfway around the globe to South America, where there was too little rainfall, and all that in the form of natural gas. Coal rounds out the fossil fuel picture, and I'll be brief on coal and the non-fossils before we come back. In developing economies, this fuel of industrialization often is a reasonable indicator of economic health. In the OECD, coal markets are more characterized by competition with other fuels in power generation and therefore often driven by politics as much as by prices. And 2013 was no exception. Overall, coal markets slowed. Consumption growth of 3% remained below its long-term average. Production growth was the weakest since 2022. Prices fell in all regions on destacking and low demand, while regional price differentials narrowed with intensifying competition among suppliers. The big story in coal markets last year is China, where coal accounts for 67% of the national energy mix. Coal consumption rose by 4% in 2013, less than half the 10-year average, which is 8.3%. Now, new policies to conquer local pollution by shutting down coal-intensive production or by encouraging coal substitution for gas may have played a very small part, but in fact they kicked in only very late in the year, and such measures are severely constrained by the restricted availability of natural gas. Also in China, finally, the share of the service sector in GDP has exceeded that of the industrial sector for the first time ever, and so moderating industrial demand will have been a contributing factor. But overall still, I find it hard to reconcile the coal slowdown with the steady numbers of official GDP growth which have been reported for that year. Elsewhere, we find data corresponding to the fuel switching which I just described with natural gas. In India, rapidly declining domestic gas production and the price advantage of coal over LNG imports has caused coal consumption to rise by almost 8%, the second largest volumetric increase on record. In the OECD, US consumption rebounded on higher natural gas prices. In the European Union's shrinking energy market, coal contracted faster than gas, losing market share also to renewables. Now, coal production and trade mirror these patterns. Chinese coal production slowed to 1.2%, the lowest increment since 2000. This was the first time in 15 years that China did not record the world's largest increase in coal production. Indonesia did. China has become the world's largest coal importer in 2012, and 2013 has seen cheap coal making further big inroads into the Chinese market. In an environment of falling coal prices and rising transportation costs, producers were very quick to adjust, as we are used from coal markets actually. Production increased the most among suppliers with easy access to Pacific markets, such as Indonesia or Australia, also to some extent Canada, while production in the US and Colombia fell, quite in line with falling demand in Europe and with global price differentials. Let's round it out with a quick look through non-fossil fuels. There's something interesting here, which maybe you have been aware, I was not, which is that the share of non-fossil fuels in total power generation was actually on a declining trend throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, as renewables were too small to make a difference, and as the growth of hydro and nuclear failed to keep up with total power generation growth. It's only over the past decades that faster hydro growth, and especially, of course, the scaling up of renewables, have halted this decline of the share of non-fossils in total power. 2013 was a big year for non-fossil fuels. Growth was above average. They increased their share of global power generation to almost 1/3, and in the process crowded out fossil generation in the European Union and the US. To these gains, nuclear made the smallest contribution, basically simply by ending 2 years of decline. Post-Fukushima safety reviews were scaled down and fewer reactors were out of operation. In Japan, generation continued to fall, but from already extremely low levels. As of today, all of Japan's nuclear reactors are already offline. Elsewhere, declines in some countries were offset by growth, mostly in the US and China. Global hydro growth slipped to 2.9%, down from 4.5% the year before, largely because of slowing capacity additions in China. And otherwise, surprise, surprise, it has been driven very much by precipitation patterns. It may have been slow growth, but it was enough to lift the share of hydropower in global primary energy to a new record last year. This leaves us with renewables, the largest contributors to non-fossil growth in 2013. Power generation from renewables grew by more than 16%, but this was the lowest growth rate since 2009, while growth in volume terms recorded an all-time high. Renewables made a larger contribution to primary energy growth than natural gas last year. This is in volume terms. As a share of global electricity generation, renewable power has now reached 5.3% globally, up from 2.7% 5 years ago. And as a share in total primary energy, renewables for power, so this is wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, accounts now for 2.2%. If you add in, to complete the picture, renewables for transport, biofuels and biodiesel, the total share of renewables in total global primary energy now stands at 2.7%. Renewables have grown in all regions and in almost all countries. The European Union as a bloc is still ahead of the US and China, both in annual increments and in the share of renewables and power. The European Union now produces 15% of its electricity from renewable sources. But at the same time, the European Union growth rate has slowed the most, from almost 21% in 2011 to 18% in 2012 to 13.5% last year. That left even the 2013 volume increments smaller than the 2011 and 2012 increments. It is no accident that this slowdown affects most the very region where penetration rates and therefore subsidies are highest. This coincidence of slower growth rates with high volumetric contribution of renewables points to the underlying dilemma. Renewables as a bloc are still subsidized. Sizable annual increments reflect the scale renewables have already reached, while the slowdown in growth rates indicates the weakening of financial support as they scale up and as the burden of rising subsidies on societies basically starts to become unbearable. A development therefore most pronounced where penetration rates are highest in the European Union, where you see subsidies being cut off on every corner, while the volume increment is still impressive. An easy way of weaving the annual fuel-by-fuel changes, so we're through with that, into a coherent pattern is to look at how they affect the global fuel mix. With the exception of gas, which saw its market share dip to about 24%, the shares of each fossil fuel pushed into unfamiliar territory. Oil's share declined to 33%, a new low in our data set, and extending a 40-year falling streak that goes back to the first oil price shock in 1973. Coal's share took another step on the steady upward march that had started in 22 when non-OECD industrialization took off in earnest. Its share increased to 30%, the highest since 1970. Now, carbon emissions per energy unit, as we know, vary widely among fossil fuels, or among fuels in general, and so the evolution of the fuel mix has implications for carbon emissions. In 2013, non-fossil fuels in power enjoyed relatively strong growth, increasing their aggregate share of primary energy. Despite this, the global carbon emissions grew almost as rapidly as total primary energy because of the rising share of coal in the fuel mix. This has been a very important trend over the years. Carbon emissions have grown less rapidly than GDP, courtesy of improved energy efficiency, but they did keep pace with energy consumption. In other words, there has been no change in the carbon intensity of the global fuel mix over the last decade. In the OECD, carbon emissions per unit of energy have declined in 2013 due to the increased share of non-fossil fuels. In the non-OECD, the rising share of non-fossil fuels was offset by the rising share of coal and the declining share of natural gas, and emissions grew at the same rate as primary energy. The net result is that carbon emissions continue to rise far too fast for comfort, restrained by improving energy efficiency, but not impacted or affected by changes in the global fuel mix. And mechanically, given economic growth, these are the two drivers. Efficiency gains are good, and carbon intensity of the existing fuel mix. In the US, for example, much of the large decline in emissions recorded in 2012 was reversed last year as the power sector switched back to coal and away from gas. From the dimensions of the system, renewables 2.2, coal 1/3, gas 1/4, it's easy to see how even small switches from coal to gas could dramatically impact global emissions growth. The one region which reaped benefits from changes in the fuel mix was the European Union, where strong growth of renewables and hydro contributed to declines in both coal and gas use in power. European Union emissions last year were more than 13% below the 1990 level, the Kyoto benchmark, and almost back, actually, to where they were in 1969. For the world as a whole, however, emissions are 55% above 1990 levels. Let me conclude by returning to one of the issues I raised at the beginning, namely the linkages between energy and the economy, and specifically to an example of how the remarkable shift in physical energy balances, which we have seen in the last few years, will have an effect, I think, on the global economy. China, the US, and Russia are the world's top 3 energy producers. China, the US, and Russia are also the world's top 3 energy consumers, and in that order. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels, while the US and China are the second and third biggest importer after Japan. Over the last 10 years, physical energy balances for these countries, by physical energy balance, I simply mean domestic production minus consumption. Physical balances between these countries have shifted. Globally, the US had the biggest increase in oil and gas production and over the last 10 years. And believe it or not, the US also had the biggest decrease in oil consumption globally over the last 10 years. China had the biggest increase in coal production and in the consumption of every single fossil fuel. Russia had the second biggest increment in oil production. Working out the net results of changes in physical production and consumption shows China's deficit for oil and gas worsening by almost exactly the same magnitude by which the US deficit improved. As a result, the Chinese primary energy deficit overtook that of the US for the first time last year. Russia's surplus improved for every fossil fuel over this period, so far allowing it to maintain its position as the world's largest holder of a primary energy surplus. These shifts, why do we bother? Because these shifts in physical energy balances do have macroeconomic implications. One of them is a global balance of payment effect. Energy accounts for about 15% of all global trade in goods and services. That's a lot. And changes in national energy balances therefore typically have a sizable effect on any country's balance of payment. In the US, energy imports today still make up about half of the trade deficit. However, on the back of diminishing oil and gas imports, this deficit is shrinking fast. China, on the other hand, sees increasing import dependence eating into its trade surplus. If you do the numbers, about half of today's surplus in trade is eaten up by energy imports. Despite rapid economic growth, energy imports as a share of GDP have almost tripled in China from 2003 to 2013. And mind you, this is now in dollar terms, it's not just physical balances. Russia has a sizable trade surplus due to its energy exports. However, if you express it as a share of GDP, the non-energy related deficit has doubled over the last 10 years, while energy exports have grown in line with GDP. Expressed as a share of GDP, Russia's overall trade surplus is falling fast. Its non-energy trade deficit is actually at 11% now, rising fast, a very unstable situation. If one would have asked any economist over the last 10 years for potential sources of trouble to the global economy, then these global trade imbalances would have loomed large in the answer. From today's point of view, it seems as if global energy balances, by eating into the US deficit and by eating in the Chinese surplus, are becoming a part of the solution globally. The two countries, of course, are affected in different ways. Where does this leave us? Now, I've done this now for 10 years, so allow me for a little personalized conclusion, but it applies to this issue as to any other issue of the Stats Review before. Energy goes directly or indirectly into any type of economic activity. It's a true basic good. It clearly matters, and we have just seen an example that the link between energy and the economy is not a one-way street. But few economists devote time to it. By taking energy matters out of this wider context, I think the discussion suffers and often does not reflect the attention the topic deserves. Second, every year we encounter weird twists and turns in the data. And every year, in the journey to find out what happened and why, it is rigorous interrogation of the data which delivers answer. This is another aspect where more work could benefit us as an industry and also those who need to understand the type of work we are doing. And finally, there is this old adage which always creeps up at the end of every stats review: markets matter. More often than not, it's actually markets work. It comes with an addendum, however, if you let them. In global energy and in energy politics, perhaps more than elsewhere in policymaking, we see both sides of this coin. Now, this is not policy evaluation, is not what the Stats Review is about, but it is what falls out of the objective data we collect year after year, and last year was no exception. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, that was really great. I wish we had a lot more time and could listen to you for far longer. And for many more years, but thanks for all the great reviews and outlooks, and we'll make sure to have you back in whatever capacity you're working in the energy markets. This is a great turnout, and we have a lot of people, so I really want to open it up to everyone here. Let me just ask one or two questions to kick it off, and I kind of want to ask you one or two topical questions too, to the extent you want to weigh in on what people are thinking about today in policy circles and markets. Just to clarify one point you made here, though, I just want to make sure I understood when you talked the remarkably low level of oil price volatility we've seen in the last few years, and you sort of said this is a happy coincidence of U.S. supply largely offsetting a historically high level of disruption. You do hear people say things about how there's something structurally different in oil markets. Shale can be ramped up and down more quickly to respond to price changes. I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying. There's nothing structurally different. Volatility will be back, but it's just kind of been a happy coincidence for 2 years. Is that?
No, there's two different things. I mean, it has been I don't know about happy, but it has been a sort of a tight standoff or balance or uneasy truth over the last 3 years. But the other aspect is also true, just has nothing to do with this balance. Should oil prices come down, you would see it more likely a flexible response from shale oil production, different from what we had, for example, in the 1980s. When prices collapsed in the 1980s, the new volumes which were coming on were largely in the North Sea and Alaska, run by private enterprises, and these guys faced an almost binary choice as oil prices collapsed. Either to stop, shut in production, or to eat the costs and cut their own costs to accommodate these lower prices. Because they needed cash flows, they all decided to keep production going and adjust their own costs. This will be different because of the high well density in shale production, you will see much less of a binary choice and much more of a smooth supply response if prices fall. And how this works itself out, we could already study after 2012 when gas prices fell so much and you immediately saw wells being shut down and rigs being diverted into tight oil production. So it's true that you have this flexibility in the response, but it is a chapter which will be opened only after the current standoff has been decided in the favor of lower oil prices in this case.
Turning to one policy issue, you mentioned the price disconnects we'd seen in the U.S. as a result of infrastructure. Infrastructure responded, and then you made some comment, I forget exactly how you worded it, around policy now leading to disconnects showing up in the market. And we've seen some of that. LLS and Brent were actually not that far apart, but they kind of widened at the end of last year, and people suspect that may come back again. I was wondering if you could talk about, there's a lot of debate in the U.S. now about how flexibly our refining system can respond to increases in tight oil production or how large a price discount might be. I was wondering if you had comments on that. I'm going to switch this with yours because your microphone has a little...
Back there.
No, just this microphone's working better. Or you can, okay, go back there.
I can look the enemy in the eye.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. So I think, as you have argued actually rightly, these current export restrictions are an obvious inefficiency in the system, in the sense that what happens is you get discounted crudes available in the U.S. They become refined domestically, and the U.S. has turned into, I think, one of the largest product exporter over the years on the back of this development. Because products are traded globally, the consumer does not benefit. Prices on the pump have not related to these discounts. Somebody else in the system, and we all know who benefits from this situation. That's a local inefficiency. And that will continue to be the case as long as crude exports are restricted. And then you have the buildup of infrastructure which drives down these differentials, pipelines and such things. And in the future, of course, there may at some point come a problem with refining capacity if tight oil growth continues to grow as fast as we see right now. And then you have this problem that refining capacity will have to adjust, hopefully, before that, because we're all in favor of free trade, and because it's such an obvious inefficiency, the US will start to gradually loosen its export policy. We assume that over the foreseeable future, the US will remain integrated in global markets also by allowing the export of crudes. However, I think it's also important that this is a local problem which dwarfs another big reorientation in global trade, which we are witnessing, which has started already, which is that because of the march of North America towards higher self-sufficiency in energy, including in oil, over the next 2 decades or so, you will see a need for the entire exports of the Middle Eastern region, which go to North America, to be redirected into Asia. And that will not be enough in our estimates to feed Asian demand, so they will also have to import more crude from places such as Africa and the former Soviet Union. And that kind of massive redirection of global oil trade, a development again which has already started. African producers also already make their first, sometimes bad experiences with having only one potential customer left. That kind of big shift in trade is fraught with, of course, huge degree of risk and will change all sorts of political and geopolitical considerations. And against that one, the US problem of exports pales a little bit.
And that raises, I'll just ask one more question, then open it up. That raises, you talked about the supply from the Middle East and the extent to which Asia and the rest of the world will still depend on it, notwithstanding a tight oil boom in the US. Iraq plays a very large role in that, and we'll be talking more about that later this afternoon here. But I was wondering if you had comments on what you see happening in Iraq today in terms of supply to the market, and also in the medium to longer term, because Iraq plays such an important role in where the world thinks we're going to get our oil from.
Yeah. Currently, when you do the numbers, currently the situation on the ground appears to be that oil production has not yet been affected. Refineries have been affected, but they only serve the domestic market, which probably isn't in good shape currently anyway. Because most of the production facilities are in the south or in the north, and these disputes haven't extended to these areas. Iraq produces somewhere around 3.1, 3.2 million barrels per day of oil. So even if you deduct domestic consumption, that would be enough to be larger than the available spare capacity in the system, which is in Saudi Arabia and is somewhere around 2.6, 2.7 million barrels per day. It would exhaust that spare capacity. So you can speculate a long time, but if Iraq's production really were to be completely taken out, and if Iran was not supposed to help, then you would have a situation which would lead to a pretty big price spike. Now, I hasten to add that the fact that the oil price has, I think today, even gone down a little bit, but is not really reacting very much, reflects the obvious consideration that this is an unlikely scenario. In either case, everybody who would bring Iraqi production to a standstill, if he has at the same time the power over this country, would hurt himself or herself. You know? And so markets seem not to anticipate this scenario at the moment. But it's possible.
That's the prompt price. And what's happened to the back of the curve, just in terms of the medium term?
Well, in the medium term, Iraq was always a component which was expected to contribute to global production growth. And the longer these situations continue and the more they impair the operations of international companies doing the production there, the more, of course, there will a gap emerge in what most people had forecasted a few years ago and what actually happens.
Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions. We have microphones to go around. Please identify yourself and keep your question brief.
So I'm Peter Kalaman, Columbia University.
It should be on, but let's...
Oh, no, it's on. Yeah.
Okay, good.
And,
that way people watching online can
I
hear
guess
you
you
as well.
don't track data on exploration, but I'm just wondering if you've seen a trend in expenditures on exploration, specifically in response to perceived risk of stranded assets.
No, not in that response. Exploration is sort of a longer-term business. But and we don't track exploration expenditures, that is correct. What you do see, however, is that we are now in an age where everybody talks about, at least on a company level, talks about capital discipline and restraining capital expenditures and having to behave and all that. And the background to that, for example, is an interesting observation. Many people look at the oil price still and they think somehow it reflects the marginal cost of something, right? Like we are used to for cars and everything else, price equals marginal cost. In oil markets, this is not the case because the marginal barrel is somewhere in the desert of Saudi Arabia, costs $3.50 and is inaccessible. So on very fundamental, simple economic grounds, you can't apply the usual functions. What we do observe, however, in oil markets is a reverse empirical relationship, namely that costs tend to follow prices with a lag, which is of different magnitude in different regions. And so what you have seen over the last 10 years or so when the oil price escalated until 2011 was that costs have followed suit. Now the oil price has stabilized and immediately the talk starts about capital discipline, having to rein in costs and all. And the next step might be, if prices continue to be stable or come down, that costs will adjust as well. This matters because it will affect companies' behavior and companies' expenditures. I give you just one example. People always worry when it comes to these kind of discussions, at which point will be the supply response from American tight oil, which Jason has mentioned. Right? You know, you go around, you ask current prices, current costs of production in the Bakken, depending whom you ask, somewhere between 60 and 80 bucks per barrel, and people think that from that level onwards it will fall, but this is not the case. It's impossible to calculate. You all know these stories of the truck driver in North Dakota starting salary $150,000 or something. If prices were to come down, these costs would also go down. And so where the real borderline is very hard to see. And the way companies plan their exploration activities is much more along multi-year lines and long-term projects, which takes a long, long time to conclude. For the time being, at least for our company, I don't see no link.
There's a gentleman over there in the yellow tie.
Yes, Michael Delaney with New York City. I have a question for you about your view of the durability, if you will, of low-cost natural gas prices in the U.S. We all know we have vast areas of shale, and as you point out, at certain price points, those will be exploited. But we've also heard, I think, increasingly reports of precipitous decline curves in the shale wells just because they're so efficient that you see all the production in the first year. And the real question I have relates to exports. Increasingly, we're approving LNG export terminals. In fact, as you were speaking, it appears FERC has ruled on the Cameron LNG terminal request. And those, as I understand it, are largely based on the idea of arbitrage between low U.S. prices and the prices in Shanghai or the prices in Yokohama. And the question is, are we building long-term facilities for what may prove to be a short-term phenomenon, namely that arbitrage? Do you see this as a durable phenomenon allowing a vast number of export terminals between now and 2020?
I don't think this is sort of a problem. We have indeed a high premium of Asian LNG prices over US prices, and as you have exports kicking in the longer term, you would expect that to narrow to some extent. But you have a huge demand increase in Asia from also different sources, not only nuclear replacement, but especially these Chinese attempts at increasing imports. The real question is, can these projects in the making lead to a delinking of Asian gas prices from oil indexation? Yeah, recall what happened a few years ago in Europe. What we had there was also a system where European imports were basically oil indexed. They were either LNG or pipelines from North Africa and from Russia. Then three things happened which broke that link. There was a huge amount of cheap LNG floating around right after the economic crisis, priced at spot prices looking for a home. There was gas-on-gas competition because Europe could now be serviced with cheap LNG or with oil-indexed, more expensive pipeline imports. And the linchpin, bringing these two sides together, was something which had nothing to do at all with gas markets. It was reforms of the European power sector, setting utilities free for the first time to source their own feedstocks. And what happened historically is that it was a lot of the smaller ones, often municipal utilities, who then went out and stopped buying from the big receivers of Russian gas and started buying the cheap LNG. And as a result, the big guys, the Gazproms and ENIs of this world, lost market share to such an extent that they had to go to Russia, throw up their hands and tell Gazprom, look, we're losing market shares at such a rate, you have to change your prices, or we cannot even take minimum contract volumes anymore. And that led to this, in turn, this historic announcement, I still think it was February or spring of 2010, where Gazprom said, okay, we give you spot prices for at least the next 3 years. And what we're experiencing now in a position of tight LNG markets is that you cannot get this Humpty Dumpty of indexation back together once it has been broken very easily. So even today, where Gazprom sort of competes with outages from North Africa with expensive LNG, where the spot oil index price differential has narrowed, even today they give rebates and they negotiate, and there is a fight around market shares among different suppliers. Supply competition is different from it was when prices were just oil indexed. Now in Asia, you have still a system of untarnished oil indexation. And you have a lull in global LNG markets, high prices, as we've seen last year. At the same time, we are seeing, because these projects are so large, new projects coming online, especially from Australia and from the US. Some were officially 2015, more likely maybe 2016. Right? What we are seeing right now are negotiations about these deliveries. And you can see all the consumer countries in Asia dragging their heels into the ground and trying to fight tooth and nails to having to conclude long-term oil index contracts. So they propose tolling arrangement, they propose Henry Hub indexation, all sorts of things. Now, to the extent that not all these volumes, which will be forthcoming after 2016, are contracted away today with oil index prices, there is the possibility that some of these projects need to generate cash, start to sell their gas cheaper into that market just because they're expensive and need to generate cash. That would then put pressure on the oil price indexation in Asia. To this you have to add that it looks like, if it's true that the Russians and the Chinese could finally agree on something, it looks like as if in the middle of this ramp-up of LNG supplies, you probably will get pipeline supplies from Russia. That would be the first time that there is some sort of more sizable gas-on-gas competition in Asia, which was one of the European preconditions. And the last bit in the middle is, I personally would have thought when you're hit by something like Fukushima, right, the last thing on your mind is to liberalize your power sector and engage in more risky business there. Turns out that Japan is so in dire straits because of these high LNG costs that this is exactly what they're doing, trying to liberalize their power sector in the expectation that decentralized negotiations with future LNG deliverers will bring prices down, will bring about more competition also on the supply side. China will not watch this without doing similar things when it comes to securing cheap imports. So it could be that not on the same scale, but some pieces of the European puzzle which have eroded the oil indexation fall into place into Asia. In the long term, I mean, this will be long-term business. Historically, it's clear this develops towards an integrated market like the market for oil, and for this you need spot prices globally. But this is a very long term. We still think this is more than 2 decades away. But it's a gradual process with years where you have a lot of gas accelerating it, years where you have tight LNG supplies like right now, delaying it. But in principle, it's sort of inevitable. That's where the train is going.
We have one question from someone watching online who submitted it via Twitter, which I want to ask so people watching online know they can fully participate, and because I received the question on my watch, which I think is cool. And it's from Vanessa Newman, who asks about Venezuela and asks if you have production estimates on production capacity for the next decade. Maybe to broaden the question, if you could just speak for a minute about kind of where you see production in Venezuela today and where it's headed.
Again, you know, I sort of can't speak about the political developments. What this really points at is the importance all over the place of above-ground factors versus below-ground factors. You can legitimately ask the question, so why is it that all this increase in unconventional fuels, particularly in oil, happened in the US and Canada? Why, of all the countries in the world in these places, no one would have had that on the radar? And the intuitive answer to that question would have been, well, it must be because that's where the resources are. We know there's a lot of oil sands in Canada, lots of shale rock in the US. And this answer would be almost certainly wrong, right? Because we know that Venezuela, for example, has more heavy oil than Canada. What happened in the response to 10 years of high and rising prices? Nothing came out of Venezuela. Our geologists run around telling us China has more shale resources for gas probably than the US. Nothing came out of China in response to 10 years of high and rising prices. You get this kind of response where you have open and competitive markets and where you let sort of investment happen, and then you have this competitive situation which breeds new technologies over time. Venezuela is far away from that. Mexico is moving much closer to that. It was always a nice tale to tell, you know. So Mexico and Brazil, look what happened. 20 years ago, the same situation. Then the Brazilians didn't even privatize their national oil company. All they ever did was to allow for competition to enter their energy market. 20 years later, Petrobras, one of the best deep water explorers on the planet, they found these new pre-sold resources. We did not. And in Mexico, they still didn't get their toes in the water, even though everybody can see with oil likely not to respect political boundaries that there must be some resources there. That will change now. And so when we do these long-term outlooks, we think that, or we observe that over time, these surprises in one place, like in Mexico, sort of balance out the disappointments in other places.
All right. Well, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then we're going to let you go at 1:55 as promised. So over here, the gentleman with the glasses, and then I see 3 hands. We'll take those 3, and then we'll wrap up.
My name is Roberto Bertelli. Just looking at the numbers that you show for Europe and energy consumption, how do you distinguish between efficiency percentage and economic contraction? Because I was looking at your report, like it shows something like Spain energy consumption went down 31% in 2013. That seems like totally out of proportion. Some of the countries were down 10%, but is that, how much of that is actual efficiency versus economic activity?
Well, the real question is something else, but first to your question. I mean, what you have is generally the textbook rule that energy consumption follows economic growth. If you have economic contraction, these relationships can become quite volatile. And so it's often the case that you see energy consumption holding on and then falling off a cliff as people cut down on energy needs later. Or it's often the case that it's an early indicator, takes off faster when countries come back. But the real question here is, when you look at the European Union as a unit, it is not only the sort of normal occurrence that when you have a severe recession that energy consumption follows. It is also the fact that over the long term, energy consumption is falling in Europe despite the economy growing. And the question here is how much of that are, as you say, efficiency improvements or just decline in energy intensity, and how much of that is caused actually by deindustrialization. That's the real issue here. And we've tried to play around with these numbers, and so it appears to be the case that the part played by deindustrialization is much smaller than the part played by general efficiency improvements, which would be good news. And then in a case like Spain now, you have the combination of all these factors.
I see a hand.
Oh, yeah. Hi, my name is Scholastica. I go to Rutgers University. My major is accounting and environmental science with a concentration in policy. What I want to go into in the future is policy, so it's my question is more focused on that. I know you talked about how markets work if you let them, and how the decisions of policymakers are affecting markets in a way that impact them negatively sometimes, or at least the efficiency of those markets. So my question is, which policymakers' decisions do you feel globally are most important? Like, depending on countries, do you feel like decisions made by US policymakers are affecting the market more than, say, like Russian policymakers or Chinese policymakers?
Did I understand you right? Which countries' politicians are most important in deciding and deciding about what? About energy or about carbon emissions?
Energy.
It's an interrelated web. What you have, of course, you could go make it simple and you go for the biggest consumers or producers, and then you have the three countries we were looking at, China, the US, and Russia, and their decisions. But I don't think you can say that, because very often, typically actually in energy, you have politicians messing the situation up and not making it better. And then occasionally you have politicians doing the right thing somewhere and it turns out to bring big benefits. Watch, for example, hopefully Mexico over the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And these learning effects, if people eventually do learn, one hopes, can be much, much bigger than ongoing and not changing policies in large energy consumers or suppliers. So therefore, I'd be very different to target politicians in a few countries to save my kids. That's probably not effective.
Okay. And there was a hand, over there.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the difficulties in reconciling Chinese consumption data with GDP data. That problem's been persisting for almost 10 years. As one of the real chroniclers of world energy consumption, do you do anything to try and reconcile what you believe either real consumption or real GDP might be?
Yes. We have a very long history of sometimes very tense relationships with the National Statistical Agency. Let me give you the big picture first and then go smaller. There is, when you look around China specialists and analysts, 50% of them will say it's the energy data which is made up, and 50% will say it's the GDP data which is made up. I think it depends. It depends on what's the latest target. I remember a year shortly after the announcement of big improvements in energy intensity when we run into trouble with our coal numbers because they were considered to be not fitting that picture. And this was probably a year in which the energy numbers suffered, put it this way. Currently, we are in a situation where the Chinese authorities are engaged in this really difficult exercise to rebalance the economy. They have recognized the problem. They are also afraid, more than anything, of declining economic growth and the social unrest this may cause, and always willing to throw the kitchen sink on it. And currently, the thing to obey to was that they basically announced before the year that economic growth would be okay. Also, if I dive down a little deeper, it seems that the slowdown in energy consumption in China is so widespread across fuels, right? It affects oil, middle distillates, it all fits together. It affects coal. And to answer the second part of your question, we do, for example, calculate coal consumption as a derived number from production and imports and stock changes because we have problems with the official accounts. So there seems to be that the errors sort of are clearly constant, not the errors, the parallelity of the slowdown is clearly very pointed in energy markets. And also in 2014, China has given itself a so-called mini stimulus for economic growth, for which there really wasn't any reason if the reported GDP number was correct. Right? So I think the indicators this time point at more problems on the GDP side.
So we have time for one last question, if it's brief and the answer is brief. Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is George Crawford. I'm a student at the Middlebury College. I had a quick question about the Clean Power Plan, which was announced on June 1st by Barack Obama. It calls for a 30% cut in carbon emissions from the power sector. And I was wondering what impacts do you see coming from that, specifically within energy consumption and production in the U.S.?
Well, the good news probably is that this leaves, as I understand it, leaves large leeway to the states on how they're going to implement these targets, and hopefully some of them will choose market mechanisms, not more regulation. The underlying thing, which is important to understand, is again about the dimensions of the system. Because coal and gas are so large and renewables are so small, and because you get half the carbon emissions from generating a kilowatt hour with gas instead of coal, the following numerical example is true. If you were to take 1% of global power generation today, and you would switch from coal to gas only for 1%, that would generate emission savings equivalent to an increase of the global volume of renewables by 11%. Think about this for a minute. The 1% switch between coal and gas in global power is sort of the daily margin of error. This is imminently doable if you had a carbon price or something like that. An increase of renewables by 11% globally is going to be expensive, difficult, and take some time. Right? This is where the low-hanging fruits are. And that is where I think some of this discussion needs to target. That it never has been really tackled shows you that we never had a global policy instrument, and you're not going to get this with regulation. You get this only by employing the market to drive these changes through a carbon price. The history of regulation is so fraught, and we've seen so many things going wrong. We don't have time for that now, but trust me on that one.
I was just going to ask a follow-up in the 90 seconds we had left, which was, when you talk about coal to gas switching, you hear a lot of people say, well, the U.S. isn't really getting the benefit people think we are because we're exporting more coal. I was just wondering if you had comments on the extent to which you think an increase in U.S. coal exports changes price enough to change demand and is actually additional to global consumption.
It's the perfect example for how regulation can go wrong. What you have seen in 2012 was very low gas prices, crowding out on a massive historic scale again of coal out of U.S. power generation, and some of that coal, that's what you're referring to, lying around becoming available for exports. It was exported to Europe where it was cheap enough to compete with more expensive natural gas. As a result, in Europe, in power generation, the share of coal went up, whereas in the U.S. it had gone down. Sort of European carbon emissions for power generation went up after 20 years of climate change policies, and the U.S. Carbon emissions fell after 20 years of doing nothing. Now, that episode has an interesting lesson, because of course the Europeans haven't only talked about climate change for 20 years, they also were the only region giving themselves a carbon price. And the carbon price was designed to avoid exactly this kind of occurrence, switching from lower carbon to higher carbon fuels. Why didn't it? Because it was too low. Why was it too low? Many reasons, but one of them is that for the Europeans it was never good enough to just have a carbon price. They had to also give themselves efficiency targets and quotas for renewables. They made these quotas mandatory. They enforced their implementation. They subsidized it at great cost to society. They never linked it to the carbon price system. And because these quotas were mandatory and implemented, of course there was less demand for carbon permits necessary, because now you had a higher share of renewables in the system. And surprise, surprise, because that caused the carbon price drop so much, the remainder of the power generation system saw this rapid increase of coal. It's like best intentions. Let's have some renewable targets too. And then the law of unintended consequences. That brings down the carbon price. That brings up the coal use and energy use. That's just what happens to when you try to regulate a market which is sometimes too big, too complicated to be really calculated beforehand. And we see that all the time.
Great. Well, that's a good note to end on. My cool email Twitter watch says it's 1:55, so we're going to stop on time. And I wish we had another hour. But Christof always promises to return, and I'm sure in whatever capacity and wherever you're working, you'll do that again. And we look forward to having you here whenever you're in New York. So please join me in thanking Christof Rühl.